Greetings, humans of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you, as always, from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA, with some more historical insights to brighten your life. And I know I've said definitely a nation of storytellers. And as such, this nation is full of tall tales, full of characters like Paul Bunyan, Johnny Appleseed, Pecos Bill, perhaps countless others. I thought a good place to start would be America's most famous lumberjack, Paul Bunyan. So large that during his birth, it took 7 storks to carry him to his parents in Bangor, Maine, or Wisconsin or Michigan, depending on, who's telling the story, on the day of his birth. Also, I am pronouncing it correctly. It's not Bangor, it's Bangor. The more you know. The man who grew so large, it was said that him dragging his axe created the Grand Canyon, and his Blue Ox Babe's footsteps created the 10,000 Lakes of Minnesota. And now to the of this giant woods. The stories of Paul Bunyan first began in the logging camps of Wisconsin in the 1800s. The tales partly served as a way for the logger elves around the campfire. Fantastic exploits of this mythical woodsman were more often told to camp visitors and newbie lumberjacks. The veteran woodsmen would tell these stories to the younger woodsmen to entertain them and amuse them. The lumberjacks would tell the stories as if they actually happened, to see how much they could get the new lumberjacks and tourists to believe. And to further claims, the oldest lumberjacks among the group would swear that they knew Paul Bunyan or members of his crew, which I find very amusing because even if you doubt the claims made by the lumberjacks, are you really going to call an old man a liar? I know I wouldn't. He'd probably seen so much. It's often been said that word of mouth is the best, and these tales show proof of that. And as time went on, these tales left Wisconsin and moved all throughout the logging camps of the Midwest. As time went on and the lumberjacks migrated all across the country and into Canada, they became more commonly known and as such began to change. These stories would soon gain national acclaim when in 1901 a man named that's a funny name, was introduced to the tales when he stayed at a logging camp in the Pacific Northwest with 3 brothers. 7 years later, in 1908, he would move to Minneapolis, Minnesota, as operations manager of the Red River Logging Company. And Lafayette would also be the first person to ever put stories about Paul Bunyan onto paper when an ad campaign in which he sold 5,000 brochures to the Red River Logging Companies and sent them to the Red River Logging Company's business partners. These brochures were titled Introducing Mr. Paul Bunyan of Westwood, California. Mixed in with descriptions of the company's products was a handful of the Paul Bunyan stories that Lafayette had heard in the Pacific Northwest logging camps, well, rewritten using advertising language. However, there was a problem. During this time, Paul Bunyan was mostly known to loggers. As such, the business partners to whom Lafayette sent the pamphlets could not really care less. In 1957, William Lafayette himself said there were even a lot of people in the logging business who had never heard of Paul Bunyan. When it got to the wholesaler and lumber dealer and the manufacturer who was buying the lumber for factory purposes, they didn't know anything about Paul Bunyan, and there was all kinds of confusion. William Lafayette took this opportunity and doubled down. Lafayette was determined to make Paul Bunyan of Red River lumber. So he started another campaign. The company began selling a new kind of wood called Paul Bunyan's pine. Lafayette also released a with more fleshed out Paul Bunyan stories to familiarize the customers with Paul Bunyan. Once again, people were sort of underwhelmed by Paul Bunyan because obviously, who would care about a lumber company's mascot? Next story. Besides creating his own tales for Paul Bunyan, Lafayette also introduced new characters into these Paul Bunyan stories, like Sourdough Sam, Paul Bunyan's camp cook, who made everything except coffee out of sourdough, among other characters who did not have much appeal. He also made Paul Bunyan a literal giant than just being, about 7 feet tall at the tallest. And interestingly, Lafayette's stories were from the original source material that had caused scholars to coin a new term, fake lore, which is a literary invention passed off as an older folktale. And interestingly, most of the stories in which Paul Bunyan appears nowadays seem to use Lafayette's larger-than-life version of Paul Bunyan rather than the traditional version that was spread throughout logging camps during the 1800s, which was a 7-foot-tall woodsman who could outdrink, outsmoke, and outwork any man he came across. And some of you might be wondering about the original tales in which Paul Bunyan appeared. Well, those are well documented thanks to 2 people. We'll get to that in a moment. Interestingly, around the time William Lathhead was working, a student at the University of Wisconsin was collecting the original Paul Bunyan stories in great detail. Her name was Kay Bernice Stewart, and she was of a timber cruiser. That's someone who goes into forests and collects information about the trees there and how much lumber can be harvested. Growing up, she spent many years in the logging camps of Michigan and Wisconsin, and also grew up hearing about the legends of Paul Bunyan from the loggers who worked these camps. And under the guidance of her professor, Homer A. Watt, she began collecting Paul Bunyan stories camps of Wisconsin in 1912. They found that Paul Bunyan was a man who stood 7 foot tall and had a stride of 7 feet, and was so powerful no man could outdrink, outsmoke, or outwork him. He also had a massive lung capacity and could break the limbs off trees just by talking. He was also said to be very clever and would find solutions to problems that most people would think would be completely hopeless. However, he was unable to write and would keep track of his man's hours by making tally marks, and when he needed supplies, he would draw pictures of what he needed. And one of the stories of Paul Bunyan uses in a rather hilarious circumstance. When his men needed grindstones, he drew pictures of grindstones, but instead got wheels of cheese because the pictures were not detailed enough. And in several of his stories, he was joined by his blue ox, Babe. And if you're wondering why Babe is blue, it was because he was originally white, but he stayed outside during a blue snowstorm and he was dyed blue. Babe was also said to be able to do the work of 9 horses and weighed somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 pounds. And you may notice that some of these stories aren't as outlandish as some of the other tales you may have been told in school, because these were meant to be somewhat believable to fool the newbies who may be in the log camp. Like how the story of how Paul Bunyan once ordered a town in Wisconsin to feed his logging crew. Everything was going fine until the delivery man accidentally dumped the cartload of peas into a hot spring. Rather seeing this as a loss, Paul just added the right amount of salt and pepper into the hot spring, and he and his crew had pea soup for the entire winter. And now I'm about to say something that may surprise some of you. Would you believe me if I told you that Paul Bunyan may have been based on a real man? That's right, the legendary logger may have had a real-life counterpart. Many historians believe that the legendary figure Paul Bunyan was based, at least partially, or maybe in a large part, on an actual lumberjack, a man named Fabien Fournier, who was a French-Canadian who moved south and got a job as the foreman of a logging crew in Michigan after the Civil War. He stood over 6 feet tall at a time when the average man barely cleared 5 feet, with huge hands. He was also rumored to have a double set of teeth which he used to bite off hunks of wooden rails, and in his spare time, like other loggers, enjoyed drinking and brawling, and his signature move was to headbutt someone. However, he met a rather gruesome end. One November night in 1877, while he was getting off a boat, a man asked Fabien where he was bound, and he replied to hell. Well, this was in the notoriously rowdy lumber town of Bay City, Michigan. He was killed that night, and his death and the sensational trial of his alleged killer, who was later acquitted, fueled tales of Saginaw Joe's rough and tumble life and his lumbering prowess in logging camps in Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and beyond. And over time, Fournier's legend combined with that of another French-Canadian lumberman, a man named Bon Jean, who played a prominent role in the Papineau Rebellion of 1837, which was when loggers and other working men in Saint name I'm afraid of mispronouncing, so instead I'm just going to spell it Eustache, Canada, revolted against the British regime of the newly crowned Queen Victoria. And the French pronunciation of this man's full name is believed to have become anglicized over time into Bunyan. Bonjean, Bunyan. And the first Paul Bunyan story, which was called Round River, made it into print in 1906, which was penned by a journalist named James McGilvery for a local newspaper in Oscoda, Michigan. And in 1912, McGilvery collaborated with a poet on a Paul Bunyan-themed poem for American Lumber magazine, earning Paul Bunyan his first national exposure. And this now brings us to one of my personal favorite tall tales, and that is the legend of Johnny Appleseed. Although legend may not be the right word, and I'm sure that some of you, or most of you out there in grade school, probably heard the story of Johnny Appleseed, the man who ran around the country during westward expansion, which at that time was anything west of Pennsylvania. So Ohio, Michigan, mostly Ohio, but yeah, Ohio, mostly. Planting apple trees. And his story has been imbued with a tint of a fairy tale. Now, some of you may think of Johnny Appleseed as a barefoot wanderer whose apples were uniform orbs. And this is due, in large part, to the popularity of a segment of the 1948 Disney feature Melody Time. which depicted Johnny Appleseed in Cinderella fashion, surrounded by blue songbirds, and a jolly guardian angel. However, this is flawed. You see, John Chapman, which was his real name, and he did, by the way, wear a pot on top of his head as a hat. That is true. Great apple seeds to grow apples. And this is a problem because apples just grown from straight seeds tend to be bitter and tart. And these kinds of apples were used to make apple cider. Hard apple cider, that is, not the sweet cider that many people love. Eating apples are grown by a process called grafting, which is where a tree is, that is to say, the best specimen of a tree is split down the middle and then joined to the half of another tree. Or even a piece of a plant may be implanted into another plant, and that forms a new type of plant. And I've never said plant so many times in my life. Anyway, back to the story of John Chapman, or Johnny Appleseed. At the turn of the 19th century, speculators and private companies were buying up large pieces of land in the Northwest Territory, which is present-day Ohio, Michigan, and Illinois, waiting for settlers to arrive. Starting in 1792, the Ohio Company of Associates made a deal with potential settlers. Anyone who is willing to permanently homestead on the wilderness beyond Ohio's first permanent settlement would be granted 100 acres of land. To prove their homesteads to be permanent, settlers were required to plant 50 apple trees and 20 peach trees in 3 years, since an average apple tree took roughly 10 years to bear fruit. And enter Chapman, who realized that if he could do the difficult work of planting these orchards, he could turn them around for profit for the incoming frontiersmen. And so he wandered from Pennsylvania to Illinois. He would advance just ahead of settlers, cultivating orchards that he would sell them when he arrived, and then head to more undeveloped land. And yes, like I said before, he would tote a bag full of apple seeds and wear a pot on his head. As a member of the Swedenborgian Church, whose belief system explicitly forbade grafting, which they believed caused trees to suffer, which was why he used apple seeds. And some of you out there might be thinking, well, why didn't the people who bought the farms just graft them themselves? Well, they found that their effort was better spent planting apples for drinking, not for eating. You see, apple cider provided those on the frontier with a safe, stable source of drink. And in a time and place where the water could be full of very, very bad bacteria, cider could be drunk without worry. And it is also interesting to note that today only one tree planted by John Chapman still survives on a family farm in Nova, Ohio. Now that also gives us a chance to discuss one of my personal favorite legends that actually happened, by the way, and that, of course, is the legend of Casey Jones. No, not the guy from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but the celebrated American locomotive engineer, who was immortalized in song. So, come all around me if you want to hear the story about a brave engineer. Casey Jones was the rounder's name. On a big 10-wheeler, he rode to fame, as the song says. He was born John Luther Jones on March 14th, 1863 in Missouri. And as a boy, he moved with his family to Casey, Kentucky. And that is where he got the nickname Casey Jones. He was also a family man who abstained from alcohol and converted to Catholicism when he and his wife married. He was also known for his punctualness and getting trains in on time, and he was well liked by everyone who knew him. At the time of the crash, Jones was living in the town of Jackson, Tennessee, with his wife and 3 children. The year was 1900. The date was April the 30th. Casey Jones and his fireman, Sim Webb, on the night of April 29th, Casey Jones and his fireman, Sim Webb, rolled into the Memphis, Tennessee station from Canton, Mississippi. They went to the checking-in office and were prepared to head home when Casey Jones heard somebody call out, "Joe Lewis has just been taken with cramps and can't take his train out tonight." To which Casey replied, "I'll double back and pull Lewis's old number 638. So at 11 o'clock that night, Casey and Sim Webb climbed aboard the big engine and eased her out of the station and through the South Memphis yards. 4 o'clock in the morning on the night of the 30th of April, the little town of Vaughn, Mississippi, a long winding curve just above the town, and a long sidetrack beginning about where the curve ended, was the site of when it happened. Casey yelled to Sim Webb, "There's a freight train on the siding." Casey knew that the siding there was a long one, and he passed many other freight trains on it, and so he figured he would do the same that night. However, there were 2 separate sections of a very long train on the sidetrack that night, and the rear one was a little too long to get all its length off the main track and onto the siding. The freight train crews figured on sawing by. That is, as soon as the passenger train passed the front part of the train, it would move forward and the rear freight would move up, thus clearing the main track. However, Casey Jones was doing about 50 miles an hour, which was more than the freight crews bargained for. But when 638 was within 100 feet of the end of the siding, Casey Jones was horrified, and Sim Webb beheld, through the gloom of the looming shape of several boxcars in motion, swinging across the main line to the sidetrack. They knew a train crash was absolutely inevitable. Casey Jones turned to Sim Webb and said, "Jump, Sim, and save yourself," which was his last order to the fireman. However, Casey threw the train in reverse and applied the air brakes, which was all any engineer could do, and rammed 638 right into the back of the caboose. Casey Jones would later be immortalized in song thanks to Wallace Saunders, locomotive wiper who greatly admired Casey Jones. At the request of some other railroad employees, Saunders wrote down the song, and from that point, the ballad spread up and down the railroad and eventually drew the attention of the songwriting team of Lawrence Seibert and Edward Newton. They reworked the song and later copyrighted their version, and the ballad spread quickly across the country and became a national rage, in large part due to its popularity in vaudeville. And since then, many versions of the Ballad of Casey Jones have been produced. Though no two versions of the ballad are exactly alike, they all had their roots in a simple song created by a man in tribute to his hero. However, one note, in the most famous version of the song, the last verse includes a line about Casey's widow telling her children to hush their crying because they got another pop on the Salt Lake line. However, that's not actually true. Casey Jones's wife, Janie, never remarried. And with that note, I will now end this episode. However, before I go, I'd like to thank the people at trailsrus.com, thehistorychannel.com, taco.com, and the John Solo YouTube channel for the information used in this episode. Goodbye, and God bless.